She rubbed her swollen belly, looking me dead in the eye as she told me to pack my bags. She thought that fake baby bump was her golden ticket to turn my only son against me and steal the home I built from the ground up. She smiled a wicked little smile, watching my heart break, completely convinced she had finally claimed the family estate for herself. But what my greedy daughter-in-law did not know was that the very house she was trying to kick me out of never even belonged to my son in the first place. My name is Loretta. I am 62 years old, and for over 40 years I dedicated my life to shaping young minds as a high school administrator. I have always been a woman who leads with love, but I demand respect. When my beloved husband Calvin passed away 15 years ago, my entire world stopped spinning. The grief was a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate me, but I knew I could not afford to fall apart. I had a teenage son, Jamal, looking up to me and needing me to be his rock. So I wiped my tears, rolled up my sleeves, and I worked double shifts. I managed budgets at the high school by day and tutored struggling students by night. I sacrificed my own comfort, skipped vacations, and wore last year's clothes, all to make sure my boy could walk across his college graduation stage without a single dime of debt tying him down. I gave him absolutely everything so he could step into his adult life as a free and successful man. I genuinely believed my devotion would build a bond between us that nothing in this world could ever break. I was terribly wrong. The peace I had earned shattered into a million pieces on a quiet Tuesday evening right in the middle of my own living room. Jamal and his wife Keisha came over for what I assumed would be a normal family dinner. Keisha Bitinjanjitsa is 28, and from the very first day Jamal brought her home 2 years ago, she carried herself with a toxic entitlement that always rubbed me the wrong way. She treated me less like a mother-in-law and more like an unpaid maid who was standing in her way. Still, I bit my tongue and welcomed her with open arms, because a mother wants nothing more than to see her son happy. After dinner, we were sitting on the plush velvet sofa I had bought with my first retirement check. The house smelled of the peach cobbler I had baked especially for them. Suddenly, Keisha reached into her expensive designer purse. With a smug, tight smile, she pulled out a glossy sonogram photo and dropped it right onto my glass coffee table. She announced they were expecting a baby. For a split second, my heart leapt out of my chest. I was going to be a grandmother. Tears of pure joy pricked the corners of my eyes, and I reached out to pull my son into a massive hug. But before I could even stand up, Keisha raised her hand like a traffic cop to stop me. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that froze the very blood in my veins. She looked around my beautiful home, slowly tracing the custom crown molding with her eyes. And then she looked back at me with pure disdain. She said her doctor told her that stress is incredibly dangerous for the baby. She crossed her arms and stated that living around an older woman dealing with my daily routines and my constant presence was simply too much anxiety for a first-time mother. I sat there confused, waiting for the punchline, but there was no joke. Then she dropped the real bomb. Keisha leaned forward and coldly told me it was time for me to move out. She reached back into her purse, pulled out a cheap, wrinkled brochure for a budget-assisted living facility on the other side of town, and slid it across the table toward me. She said it was for the good of the unborn child. She declared that she and Jamal needed the entire estate to themselves so they could raise my grandchild in peace, without my interference dragging them down. Those words hit me harder than a physical blow. I could not comprehend what I was hearing in the house I paid for. I turned my head to look at my son, the boy I had given up my youth and my dreams for. I expected him to defend me. I waited for him to tell his wife she had lost her mind and crossed a terrible line. But Jamal could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. He stared down at his expensive shoes, shifting nervously like a scolded child, and muttered that Keisha was right. He actually told me they needed the space and that it was time for me to step aside. I sat, frozen in my own living room, surrounded by the walls my husband and I had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into building. I was forced to listen to my own son and his cruel wife throw me away like a piece of useless trash. Keisha sat back against the cushions, watching my heartbreak with absolute satisfaction. She thought she had broken my spirit. She thought she had secured her grand prize and pushed me out of my own family. She had no idea what kind of storm she had just invited into her life. This house was never just a building of brick and mortar to me. It was a living, breathing testament to Black love, resilience, and decades of backbreaking hard work. Calvin and I broke ground on this property 30 years ago. I can still see him so clearly in his faded denim overalls, wiping sweat from his brow under the blazing July sun. We handpicked every single brick of the exterior. We saved up for years to choose the solid oak floors, because Calvin wanted something strong enough to last for generations to come. Every single room in this house holds the sweet echo of our laughter, the quiet whispers of our midnight prayers, and the beautiful memories of raising Jamal into a man. When Calvin passed away suddenly 15 years ago, I clung to these walls because they were the last physical embrace I had of the man I loved. This home was my sanctuary, my safe haven, and my legacy. Then came Keisha. 2 years ago, she walked through my solid oak front door and immediately turned her nose up at the very foundation of my life. I tried my absolute hardest to welcome her with open arms. I cooked her favorite meals. I gave her plenty of space. I smiled politely when she complained about our neighborhood being too quiet and boring for her taste. But Keisha did not want a mother-in-law. She wanted a servant. She carried an air of entitlement that suffocated the warmth right out of my home. She would casually leave her dirty dishes piled high in my pristine sink, fully expecting me to scrub them for her. She would drop her expensive silk blouses on the laundry room floor without a single word, assuming I would wash and iron them. If I ever asked her nicely to pick up after herself, she would roll her eyes and sigh loudly as if I were inconveniencing her in her own personal luxury hotel. I swallowed my pride every single day. I endured her petty attitudes because I saw how blindly in love Jamal was, and a mother will endure almost anything to keep the peace for her child. But the disrespect reached a completely new level of audacity just 3 days after her dramatic pregnancy announcement. I was in the kitchen brewing my morning coffee, finding a moment of peace when the front door swung open without even a knock. Keisha marched inside, and right behind her was Todd. Todd is her sister's husband. He is a white American real estate agent who wears entirely too much cologne and walks around my neighborhood like he owns the entire city block. I had never invited this arrogant man into my home. I barely tolerated his boastful, loud mouth at our family Thanksgiving dinners, yet here he was, strutting into my foyer with a heavy metal measuring tape clipped to his designer belt and a thick clipboard in his hand. Before I could even set my coffee mug down and ask what was going on, Todd walked right past me. He did not say good morning. He did not ask how I was doing. He just unspooled his measuring tape straight across my custom mahogany dining table, letting the cold, sharp metal scrape directly against the wood that Calvin used to polish by hand. Keisha trailed right behind him, pointing at my walls and laughing out loud. I stood frozen by the kitchen island as Todd began barking out renovation ideas like he was the lead contractor on a demolition site. He loudly declared that my floor plan was entirely too closed off, and that my beautiful custom brick fireplace was an outdated eyesore that needed to be smashed with a sledgehammer. I felt a hot flash of pure anger rise from the soles of my feet. Todd did not stop in the dining room. He walked right down the hall and stepped directly into my master bedroom without even pausing to knock. I hurried after them, my heart pounding furiously against my ribs. Todd was standing in the exact center of my sanctuary, tapping his expensive pen against his clipboard. He looked at Keisha with a slick, greedy grin and said they could easily flip the master suite into a modern luxury nursery. He pointed at the adjoining wall and suggested they tear it down completely to make a massive walk-in closet for her designer shoes. He actually stood in the room where my husband took his last breath and told Keisha that once Jamal transferred the title to them, they would easily add $100,000 in equity just by gutting the place. I finally found my voice. I stepped into the doorway and demanded to know exactly what they thought they were doing in my private space. Keisha spun around slowly and gave me that condescending little smirk that I had grown to despise. She dramatically patted her flat stomach and sighed heavily as if I were a misbehaving child. She told me to lower my voice and calm down, because high blood pressure is extremely dangerous for people my age. She said Todd was just doing them a huge favor by mapping out the future renovations for when I finally moved out to the facility. I stood my ground and told her firmly that I had not agreed to move anywhere. That was when Keisha looked me up and down, like I was a pitiful stray dog that had wandered into her territory. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and said I was being incredibly selfish and unreasonable. She looked right into my eyes and casually stated that seniors belong with their own kind in places properly equipped for their declining minds. She actually said those words to my face in the house I paid for. She told me I should be excited to go to a facility where I could play bingo with other retirees, instead of taking up valuable space that a growing young family desperately needed. Todd chuckled under his breath, highly amused by her cruelty, and went right back to measuring my bedroom windows as if I did not even exist. The sheer disrespect in that room was suffocating. My hands shook with a righteous fury that took every single ounce of my willpower to contain. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to grab that metal measuring tape, rip that clipboard out of his hands, and throw them both out onto the street. But I bit my tongue. I pressed my lips together so hard I could taste a faint hint of blood. I kept quiet solely for Jamal's sake, because I knew exactly how this game was played. I knew that if I exploded in anger, Keisha would immediately twist the story. She would run crying to my son, claiming that his aggressive, unhinged mother attacked her and endangered her fragile baby. I simply turned around and walked back to my kitchen, leaving them to their arrogant delusions. But as I stood by the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the cold granite countertop, my intuition was screaming like a blaring fire alarm. This was not just a passing, disrespectful comment from an entitled girl. This was a highly calculated, coordinated invasion of my life. They were casually dividing up my kingdom while I was still breathing and making plans to erase 40 years of my history. Beneath the anger, a cold, sharp realization settled in my spirit. This went far deeper than a daughter-in-law wanting a bigger house. This was a malicious plot to rob me of my dignity and my legacy. And I knew right then and there that I had to prepare for war. I tried to keep my head down and focus on packing my life into cardboard boxes. But a mother's intuition never sleeps. Something about Keisha's pregnancy was off, terribly off. It started with the little thing that just did not add up for a woman who claimed to be carrying my precious grandchild. One Friday evening, I walked into the kitchen late at night to get a glass of water to soothe my dry throat. Keisha was sitting at the island, bathed in the soft glow of the refrigerator light. She shoved something into the stainless steel trash can the second I walked in, but she was not fast enough to hide her tracks. I saw the empty plastic container of raw, spicy tuna sushi and the half-empty bottle of expensive Pinot Noir sitting right next to her elbow. When I calmly questioned her about eating raw fish and drinking alcohol while pregnant, she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in her head. She snapped that it was non-alcoholic wine and cooked imitation crab. She told me I needed to mind my own business, stop hovering over her like a prison guard, and remember that my outdated parenting advice was not welcome in her modern household. I knew exactly what I saw, but I kept my peace, holding my tongue to protect my son's happiness. Then came the endless excuses surrounding the doctor appointments. Jamal was so incredibly excited to be a father. He bought a little leather journal to take notes, eagerly asked for time off work, and practically begged Keisha to let him come see the ultrasound and hear the baby's heartbeat. Every single time, Keisha shut him down with a vicious coldness that broke my heart. She claimed her specific clinic was still strictly enforcing old health protocols, and that partners were absolutely not allowed past the waiting room under any circumstances. She said she was categorized as high risk and could not deal with his nervous, anxious energy in the examination room anyway. Jamal, bless his kind heart, just swallowed his disappointment and waited alone in the car for hours. He would come back into the house looking so defeated, holding a blurry generic printout that looked like it had been photocopied a dozen times from a random internet search. A woman carrying a child wants her husband holding her hand, not banished to the parking lot. My spirit was completely restless. I spent my days wrapping my antique floral plates in newspaper, watching this young girl parade around my house, rubbing a belly that seemed to magically change shape and size depending on what outfit she decided to wear that day. My heart ached deeply for Jamal, who was working grueling overtime shifts to afford the expensive organic foods designer maternity clothes and premium prenatal vitamins Keisha demanded. He was completely blind to the wicked game being played right under his nose. I prayed for clarity every single night. I asked the Lord to reveal what was hidden in the dark, and he answered that prayer faster and more brutally than I could have ever imagined. It happened on a quiet, breezy Thursday afternoon. I had told them earlier that morning that I was going to the grocery store and then meeting a dear friend from my church for a late lunch, meaning I would be gone for several hours. But my friend had to cancel at the absolute last minute because her car broke down on the highway. I grabbed my few groceries and headed straight back to the house to put away the perishable items. I parked my car down the street under the large weeping oak tree because my own driveway was rudely blocked by Todd's flashy silver sports car. I walked up the driveway quietly, my sensible, soft-soled shoes making no sound against the concrete pavement. I unlocked the heavy oak front door as silently as a ghost, expecting the house to be peaceful and empty. Instead, loud, obnoxious laughter echoed down the hallway from my pristine kitchen. It was Keisha and Todd. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand still resting heavily on the brass doorknob. The tone of their laughter was not friendly or familial in the slightest. It was mocking sharp and full of a wicked, sickening triumph. I crept slowly down the hall, keeping my back pressed flat against the floral wallpaper, and stopped just outside the kitchen doorway, staying completely out of sight. I held my breath tight in my chest and peeked cautiously around the corner. What I saw in that room stopped my heart dead in my chest and changed the trajectory of my family forever. Keisha was standing casually by the stove, holding a tall glass of real, bubbling champagne. But the alcohol was not what made my blood run ice cold. She reached under her expensive maternity blouse, unfastened a thick industrial Velcro strap, and pulled out a large, flesh-colored silicone belly. She tossed the heavy prosthetic casually onto my clean granite countertop, like it was nothing but a dirty, used rag. She stretched her lower back, took a long, greedy sip of her drink, and laughed loudly, wiping a tear from her eye. She told Todd that wearing that heavy, suffocating piece of rubber all day was making her sweat uncontrollably, but it was entirely worth the massive financial payoff. Todd leaned casually against my stainless steel refrigerator, swirling the amber liquor in his own glass, and openly praised her masterful performance. He called my son Jamal the most gullible, pathetic fool he had ever met in his entire real estate career. I stood there completely frozen, unable to take a breath, as the entire sinister plot unspooled right in front of my face. Keisha bragged endlessly about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate my son. She said Jamal was so desperate to be a good providing father that he would blindly agree to absolutely anything she demanded as long as she cried fake tears and blamed her volatile pregnancy hormones. The baby did not exist. There was no precious grandchild. There was no high-risk pregnancy requiring special care. It was all a monstrous, deeply calculated lie designed to steal my family's wealth. Todd asked her to clarify the timeline, and Keisha outlined her evil strategy with a chilling coldness that made me physically sick to my stomach. She explained that the primary goal was to force me out of the house as quickly and quietly as possible. Once my bags were fully packed, and I was shoved away into some cheap budget facility, she was going to relentlessly demand that Jamal transfer the house deed entirely into her name. She was going to manipulate him by telling him it was strictly for the long-term financial security of their growing family, a necessary safety net for the child in case anything ever happened to him. Todd chuckled deeply, rubbing his greedy hands together, and said that the very moment her name was officially on the deed, they could immediately take out a massive predatory loan against the property, gut the entire place to the studs, and flip it for a small absolute fortune. But the absolute worst part, the darkest part that made my vision blur with raw, righteous fury, was Keisha's cruel exit strategy. Todd asked her how exactly she was going to explain the sudden lack of a baby 9 months down the line. Keisha simply waved her manicured hand dismissively. She took another long sip of champagne and stated that once the deed was officially transferred and the lucrative paperwork was locked in, she was going to stage a tragic, devastating miscarriage. She planned to sob uncontrollably, play the heartbroken, grieving mother to perfection, and directly blame the loss of the baby on the lingering stress of having to deal with me living in the house for so long. She would keep the house, keep the money, and leave my son completely broken and forever tied to her through a shared trauma that never even happened in reality. In that defining moment, the deep, agonizing pain of a mother's betrayal evaporated completely from my soul. The heavy sorrow that had been weighing down my tired shoulders for weeks vanished into thin air. It was instantly replaced by an ice-cold, razor-sharp clarity that filled every vein in my body. I did not feel like a discarded, helpless old woman anymore. I felt like a fierce mother bear, whose only cub was being blindly led into a dark slaughterhouse. These two arrogant grifters were standing boldly in the home my beloved husband built, drinking my expensive liquor, plotting to completely destroy my son's life and steal my hard-earned legacy. They foolishly thought they had easily outsmarted a naive elderly lady. They thought I was just going to roll over, shed a few pitiful tears, and let them take everything I had sacrificed my entire life to build. They wildly underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I did not gasp. I did not make a single sound to alert them to my presence. I slowly backed away from the kitchen doorway, silently walked out the front door, and gently clicked the heavy lock shut behind me. I walked steadily back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared intensely at the steering wheel. I was not going to cry, and I was definitely not going to scream. I was going to completely destroy them. I started my engine and drove straight to a large local electronics store on the other side of town. I walked down the brightly lit aisles with a singular determined focus, purchasing 4 high-definition hidden cameras equipped with motion sensors, night vision, and secure cloud recording capabilities. I deliberately bought ones cleverly disguised as everyday mundane objects, like a digital alarm clock, a standard USB phone charger, and a small discreet air purifier. When I returned home later that evening carrying my grocery bags, Keisha was back in the living room, wearing her heavy silicone belly, loudly whining to Jamal about her painfully swollen ankles. I smiled warmly, acting like the perfect, accommodating mother-in-law, apologized for being late with dinner and quietly went to work on my plan. Over the next 2 agonizing days, while Jamal was busy at his office and Keisha was out running up his credit cards at the mall, I strategically placed the cameras in the living room and the kitchen. I meticulously made sure every single angle of her deceit would be captured in crystal clear, high-definition video. I tested the audio feeds on my phone, ensuring that every wicked laugh, every cruel insult, and every manipulative lie would be perfectly recorded and saved directly to a secure private server. But securing the undeniable video evidence was only the very first step of my grand counterattack. The following morning, I drove to a highly prestigious downtown law firm to meet with Mr. Harmon, my trusted estate lawyer, who had expertly handled my family's affairs for over 20 years. He greeted me with a warm, familiar handshake, but his weathered face turned deadly serious as I calmly laid out the horrifying details of Keisha's fraudulent pregnancy and Todd's greedy real estate scheme. I asked him to pull my official property files to legally confirm what I already knew deep in my heart. Mr. Harmon slid a thick manila folder across his polished mahogany desk, opened it carefully, and pointed directly to the primary deed. I let out a long, deep sigh of absolute relief. My late husband Calvin was a brilliant man who always planned for every possible storm. Years before he passed away, we had wisely placed the house and the entirety of our financial assets into a bulletproof, irrevocable trust. Jamal was officially named as a beneficiary, but his name was never actually put on the deed to the property. He had zero legal authority to sell, transfer, or modify the estate in any capacity whatsoever. I controlled the trust completely, and upon my eventual passing, the assets were heavily protected by strict legal clauses designed specifically to prevent greedy, manipulative spouses from touching a single dime of our wealth. Mr. Harmon smiled a sharp professional smile and assured me that Keisha and Todd were wasting their time, aggressively fighting for an asset they could never legally touch. Even if Jamal desperately wanted to blindly give them the house, the law simply would not allow it to happen. I sat back in that plush leather chair, feeling a tremendous heavy weight lift completely off my spirit. Keisha thought she was playing a brilliant, masterful game of chess, strategically maneuvering my son and ruthlessly kicking me off the board. She had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire board and all the pieces on it. I thanked Mr. Harmon, graciously gathered my vital documents, and drove back home with a profound new sense of power and control. I was going to let Keisha confidently play her losing hand. I was going to let her put on her little dramatic show parade, her fake rubber belly around my living room, and arrogantly demand that I pack my bags. I would wait patiently in the shadows, quietly gathering my undeniable evidence day by day, until the absolute perfect moment to drop the heavy hammer of justice and end her wicked charade once and for all. The breaking point arrived just 2 days later, on a humid Thursday evening. I was sitting quietly in my favorite reading chair when Keisha suddenly stumbled into the living room, putting on a performance worthy of a national television award. She gripped the edge of the doorframe and let out a loud, dramatic gasp before collapsing onto the velvet sofa. She clutched her silicone belly with both hands, her face scrunched up in a mask of absolute agony. She began taking short, frantic breaths, rocking back and forth, and crying out that she felt a sharp, tearing pain in her stomach. Jamal came sprinting down the stairs, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He dropped to his knees right beside the sofa, grabbing her hands and begging her to tell him what was wrong. Keisha let out a theatrical sob and pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. She wailed that her doctor had warned her about her dangerously high blood pressure that very morning. She cried that the constant suffocating stress of living with an older woman was pushing her body to the absolute limit. She looked my son dead in the eye and sobbed that my negative energy and my refusal to give them privacy was going to cause her to lose their precious baby. I sat completely still in my chair, watching this magnificent display of evil manipulation. The gaslighting was so thick and toxic, it practically sucked all the oxygen straight out of the room. Jamal turned his head and looked at me with a coldness I had never seen in my entire life. The boy I had worked double shifts for, the son I had sacrificed my youth to protect, was glaring at me like I was a monster. He stood up slowly, walked over to his briefcase, and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents, along with a glossy brochure. He marched over and threw them onto the coffee table right in front of me. I looked down and saw the brochure for a cheap, grim-looking, assisted living facility located in the worst part of town. Right beside it was a legally binding power of attorney form and a property transfer deed. Jamal crossed his arms and delivered a cruel, suffocating ultimatum. He told me that my stubbornness was actively endangering his growing family. He demanded that I sign the papers immediately, handing over complete control of my finances and the house deed to him and Keisha. He said I needed to pack my belongings and move into the facility by the weekend. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, and told me that if I refused to sign the papers and leave my own home, he would pack up his wife and walk out the door. He threatened that I would never see him again, and I would be permanently cut out of my grandchild's life forever. The silence in the living room was deafening. I looked at the legal papers sitting on my glass table, and then I looked deeply into my son's eyes. I searched desperately for a tiny fraction of the sweet boy I had raised, but there was nothing left. He was completely hollowed out, entirely brainwashed by a wicked woman wearing a piece of rubber strapped to her waist. The sheer audacity of them trying to declare me a burden to society while plotting to rob me blind was staggering. But I did not scream, and I did not cry. My heart, which had been breaking for weeks, suddenly turned into solid, impenetrable stone. I realized right then that I could not save a son who actively chose to participate in his mother's destruction. I looked back down at the coffee table, and I made my choice. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the image of a weak, defeated old woman. I let out a soft, trembling sigh, and slowly reached out my hand. I picked up the thick stack of legal documents and the cheap nursing home brochure, clutching them tightly against my chest. I looked at Jamal with perfectly widened, tearful eyes, and whispered a quiet apology. I told him that I never meant to cause his wife any stress, and that I would never do anything to put my precious grandchild in danger. I nodded my head in total submission, and promised him that I would start packing my bags immediately so they could have the peace and space they needed. The transformation in the room was instant and chilling. The moment I agreed to leave, Keisha's fake tears completely vanished. She stopped clutching her stomach and sat up straight on the sofa. A smug, victorious smirk slowly crept across her face, stretching from ear to ear. She genuinely believed she had just conquered my kingdom and broken my spirit. Jamal let out a huge sigh of relief, thanking me for finally being reasonable and stepping out of the way for his future. I turned around without another word and walked slowly down the hallway toward my master bedroom. But I did not sign a single page of those legal documents. I tossed the papers carelessly onto my bed and immediately pulled out my cell phone to check the live feed from the hidden cameras I had installed. I watched the screen with an ice-cold fury as Jamal walked out to the garage to fetch some moving boxes for me. The very second he was out of earshot, Keisha pulled out her phone and frantically dialed a number. Through the hidden microphone, I heard her happily tell her brother-in-law Todd to drop everything and come over immediately. She laughed, a wicked, joyous laugh, instructing him to bring the most expensive bottle of champagne he could find, because the pathetic old lady had finally surrendered and the house was officially theirs. I sat on the edge of my bed watching her celebrate her fake victory, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, because the trap was fully set and the real show was about to begin. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp breeze, but the atmosphere inside my home was thick with an entirely different kind of chill. It was supposedly moving day. My 2 large vintage leather suitcases sat meticulously packed by the front door, just as Jamal had demanded. I stood right beside them, wearing my best tailored navy blue suit, with my pearls fastened securely around my neck. I was not dressed like a defeated elderly woman being shuffled off to a budget nursing home. I was dressed like a matriarch preparing to preside over her own courtroom. Jamal could not even look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the hardwood floor, shuffling around with rolls of packing tape and permanent markers, looking like a man carrying the weight of massive guilt on his frail shoulders. Keisha, on the other hand, was absolutely glowing with malicious victory. She paraded out of the kitchen wearing a luxurious white silk robe, sipping an expensive cup of artisanal coffee like she was the newly crowned queen of the castle. Her ridiculous silicone belly protruded under the thin fabric, a prop she wore with disgusting pride. She strutted past my suitcases and offered a condescending little pout, telling me that the moving truck would be here any minute, and she hoped the budget facility had decent oatmeal for breakfast. Before I could even respond, the front door swung wide open and Todd barged inside. He did not bother wiping his shoes. He was carrying 3 large cardboard boxes of his own. He loudly announced that he was going to go ahead and claim the downstairs guest room as his personal real estate office since I was finally vacating the premises. He dropped his boxes onto my pristine rug, rubbing his hands together, and congratulated Keisha on finally securing the bag. They laughed together, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the walls of my beautiful home. But I did not shed a single tear. I just stood there, tall and unyielding, feeling the solid oak floor beneath my feet. I let them enjoy their greedy little fantasy for exactly 2 more minutes before I decided it was time to bring down the hammer. I calmly reached behind me and turned the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door. The loud, sharp click echoed through the entire living room, instantly cutting off Keisha and Todd's obnoxious laughter. I stepped forward into the center of the room and declared in my firmest high school administrator voice that before anyone moved a single box, we were going to have one final family meeting. Keisha immediately rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. She complained that they were on a tight schedule, and she simply did not have the energy to listen to another one of my dramatic old lady speeches because it was bad for her blood pressure. I did not argue with her. I simply reached into my pocket and pressed a button on my phone. Right on cue, the heavy, solid wood doors of my private home office opened wide. Keisha and Todd froze completely as Mr. Harmon, my trusted estate lawyer, stepped out into the living room carrying his sleek leather briefcase. Right beside him was a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a thick manila folder. I introduced the second man as Mr. Vance, a highly licensed private investigator I had hired earlier that week. The smug, arrogant smiles on Keisha and Todd's faces vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden creeping panic. Jamal dropped his roll of packing tape, staring at the 2 serious men standing in our living room with absolute confusion. He asked me what was going on and why my lawyer was here on moving day. I looked my son dead in the eye and told him to sit down and pay very close attention because his education was about to begin. I picked up the television remote and mirrored my cell phone directly to the massive 70-inch smart screen mounted above the fireplace. I hit play on the video file I had saved. High-definition footage from my hidden kitchen camera filled the bright screen. The audio was crystal clear. Everyone in the room watched as the digital version of Keisha poured herself a tall glass of real champagne. We watched her unfasten the Velcro straps and rip the massive silicone belly right off her waist, slamming it down onto my granite counter. We heard her exact words echoing through the living room speakers as she laughed with Todd about how unbelievably gullible and pathetic Jamal was. The entire room listened in horrifying silence as Keisha joyfully detailed her master plan to force me out into a cheap nursing home, manipulate Jamal into transferring the house deed to her name, and then stage a fake tragic miscarriage so she could keep the property and the money all for herself without ever having to be a mother. I paused the video right on the frame of Keisha, holding the fake belly up and laughing. The silence in the room was absolute devastation. Jamal looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. All the color drained from his face, and he collapsed backward onto the velvet sofa, clutching his chest as he struggled to breathe. He stared at the screen and then looked at Keisha's stomach, where the fake bump still rested under her silk robe. Keisha was trembling uncontrollably, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but absolutely no sound came out. Todd took a nervous step backward toward the front door, desperately looking for a quick exit, but the deadbolt was already locked. That was when I delivered the final crushing blow. I turned to Mr. Harmon, and he smoothly pulled a thick stack of certified legal documents from his briefcase, placing them squarely on the coffee table, right next to Keisha's fake sonogram photo. I looked down at the two greedy grifters standing in my living room, and I smiled a cold, victorious smile. I told Keisha that she had put on a truly magnificent performance, but she made one catastrophic mistake. I explained that she spent months manipulating my son to force him to sign over the deed to this house. But the truth was, Jamal never had the power to sign anything over to her. I revealed that 15 years ago, my late husband and I placed this entire estate and every single dime of our wealth into a legally binding, irrevocable trust. Jamal's name was never on the title. He was merely a listed beneficiary without any legal authority to transfer, sell, or modify the property whatsoever. I watched the devastating reality wash over Keisha and Todd. They had spent an entire year plotting, scheming, and putting on a sinister theatrical production to steal a multi-million-dollar property that they had absolutely zero legal claim to. Their entire master plan was built on a worthless foundation. Todd stammered nervously, trying to backpedal and claim he was just giving them hypothetical real estate advice. But Mr. Vance, the investigator, stepped forward and informed Todd that his real estate brokerage would be receiving a full copy of the video footage, along with a formal complaint for predatory fraud. Keisha fell to her knees, sobbing real tears this time. But they were tears of absolute humiliation and defeat. She tried to reach out for Jamal, begging him to listen to her, pleading that she only did it because she wanted a better life for them. But Jamal recoiled from her touch, as if she were a venomous snake. His eyes were completely hollow, utterly broken by the realization that he had nearly thrown away his devoted mother for a monster who was using him as a pawn. I stood tall in the center of my beautiful home, entirely victorious. The dark, heavy cloud that had been suffocating my family was finally lifted, and the bright light of truth had burned away every single lie they tried to plant in my soil. The fallout in my living room was swift and absolutely brutal. Todd did not say another word. He took one look at the private investigator, scooped up his cardboard boxes, and practically ran out of my front door. He knew that the formal fraud complaint Mr. Vance promised would ruin his precious real estate career forever. And he fled my property like a terrified coward. As the front door slammed shut behind him, the heavy silence returned, broken only by Keisha's pathetic sobbing. She was on her knees, desperately clawing at Jamal's pant leg, begging him to listen to her. She cried that she only did it because they needed a financial head start, that her love for him was real, even if the baby was not. But Jamal finally woke up from his pathetic delusion. He looked down at the woman he had married, then looked at the silicone belly discarded like trash on the coffee table. He ripped his leg away from her grasp. His face twisted in absolute disgust. He told her to get up, pack whatever clothes she could fit into her designer purse, and get out of his sight before he called the police himself. Keisha tried to scream, tried to hurl insults at me, but Mr. Harmon simply held up his phone and reminded her that every threat she made was actively being recorded for the authorities. Keisha turned pale. Stripped of all her power, her fake pregnancy, and her dreams of stealing my estate, she walked out of my house with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The grand scheme she had spent an entire year plotting was completely reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. Once she was gone, Jamal collapsed onto the sofa. He put his head in his hands and sobbed like a broken child. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, apologizing over and over again. He told me he was so incredibly sorry for letting her manipulate him, for choosing her lies over my lifelong devotion, and for ever thinking about putting me in that awful facility. He begged me for forgiveness, promising that he would make it right, and that things could go back to the way they used to be. I looked at the boy I had given my youth, to the son I had worked double shifts for, and my heart felt a profound, heavy sadness. But my boundaries were now made of iron. I told him very calmly that I still loved him because he was my son, but forgiveness is not a magic wand that instantly repairs a shattered foundation. I explained that trust is earned, not freely given, and he had completely destroyed mine. I told him to pick up his own bags and find somewhere else to stay. He needed to figure out how to be a man on his own without relying on my money or bending to the wicked whims of a toxic partner. Jamal wept, but he knew he had no right to argue. He slowly gathered his things, hugged me one last time, and walked out the door. When the house was finally empty, I let out a long, deep breath. The suffocating tension that had poisoned my sanctuary for 2 years vanished entirely. I walked over to the front door, grabbed my 2 vintage leather suitcases, and brought them straight to my bedroom. I unpacked my beautiful clothes, put my cherished photos back on the walls, and reclaimed my kingdom. My late husband, Calvin's spirit, felt present in the quiet peace of the afternoon. Today, I am living for myself, enjoying the fruits of my decades of hard work, perfectly secure in the home I built from the ground up. I wanted to share this difficult chapter of my life because I know I am not the only mother out there who has been taken for granted. Too many of us sacrifice our own happiness to build a safe foundation for our children, only to be tossed aside when we are no longer deemed useful. But family isn't just blood, and love shouldn't come with an eviction notice. If someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time and make sure your paperwork is in order. My husband, Calvin, was a wise man, and his foresight saved my life. I urge every single one of you to protect your peace, protect your assets, and never let anyone make you feel like you are a burden in the home you worked your entire life to build. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me down in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. I read every single one. Stay blessed and stay strong, sisters.